Part 7. When I saw our first new home in Virginia, a 3-bedroom house located 2 miles outside of Lexington, my first thought was, oh my God. Had the house's former tenant, a math professor, not owned a vacuum cleaner, broom, or sponge? Why had we been so stupid, signing a lease on a house sight unseen? Dust-covered spider webs dangled from the corners of the ceilings. A track of black grime lined the carpet in the hallway, and the rest of the floors, and every counter that I could see, were dulled by a layer of dirt and dust and the crusty bodies of dead bugs. Holy fuck. Cringing at the thought of 8-month-old Austin crawling on top of so much filth, and remembering that our furniture would soon arrive, I put the kids into Paul's care and flew into action. Zipping around the house like a non-magical Mary Poppins on steroids, I vacuumed and shampooed the carpeting. I swept and mopped the vinyl floors, dusted away the cobwebs on the walls. Then I scrubbed the cabinets in the kitchen and 2 bathrooms, all the sinks and the 2 toilets, and finally the bathroom tub. I disinfected every square inch of that house until at long last I was satisfied my baby would not catch a deadly disease and die. This was before I learned that cleanliness does not equal godliness, and that in fact a baby's immune system is strengthened when he or she lives in a home that is not completely free of grime. After getting ourselves settled into our spotlessly clean, newly disinfected home, one of the first things we purchased was a plastic kiddie pool for Abby and Austin. I played in the pool with them, but soon we were joined by a little girl from across the street who was the same age as Abby. Abby and Jennifer quickly became best friends. Fortunately for Austin, they didn't mind if he crawled or soon after toddled after them, becoming a part of whatever imaginary game they played involving stuffed animals, dolls, pillows, blankets, or blocks. I could tell Paul was thrilled to be treading once again upon his old undergraduate stomping grounds, and he was as happy as a squirrel perched in the nest of an oak whenever he sat before the desk of his 3rd-floor private office in Robinson Hall. The window to his office faced west, towards the campus library, where he had spent many enjoyable hours as a young man. Even his office had once been part of a larger classroom where he had sat for several semesters, receiving intellectually engaging mathematical instruction. Everyone in the family, it appeared, everyone but me, was adjusting just fine to life in Lexington. One day, a few weeks after our move, Paul and I took Abby and Austin for a drive along the nearby Blue Ridge Parkway. The skies, since our move, had remained mostly cloudless, unlike during my earlier visits to Lexington. Sometimes it felt as if nature herself were gifting me with sunshine in order to help ease my transition into my new home. Standing at the edge of a parkway overlook that day, gazing through the glare of the afternoon sun, I studied the tiny signs of civilization in the valley below, the hodgepodge of fields surrounded by tracts of forests, the distant piece of a cutout line that I assumed was Interstate 81, and the glint of something silver, perhaps a metal roof of a farmhouse or barn. It was quiet on top of the mountain, nothing but the soft rustle of leaves from the nearby trees and the hum of a single-engine airplane. A sense of calm settled into my heart, and I wondered for the first time if Paul's soul might truly have been the driving force behind our move to the Shenandoah Valley. Unfortunately, the remembered calm of that Parkway visit vanished once I was back on the streets of Little Lexington the following day. Never in all my memory had I felt so irritated by a particular place. Part of the problem was that everywhere I went, it seemed, the grocery store, the public library, the downtown hardware store or department store, both of which closed shortly after our move, I would overhear conversations peppered with brief mentions of the war. To my shock, I discovered that everyone seemed to be talking about the Civil War. Good Lord, were these people in a time warp? Maybe it was the history of the place that caused time to stand still. Most of the architecture in the downtown had remained unchanged since the 19th century. Perhaps it was the old-time 1860s look to the buildings on Main Street that served as a visual marker in people's minds, continually reminding them that in June of 1864, Union soldiers took over the town, looting private homes and burning the campus buildings of the Virginia Military Institute, located immediately next door to Washington College, which was later renamed Washington and Lee University. Or maybe it was the Southern Shrine aspect of the town that kept the war alive. Two of the greatest icons of the Confederate Army, Commanding General Robert E. Lee and his right-hand General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, had once called Lexington home, Jackson before the war, Lee after the war. The grave sites for each of these Confederate generals, both of whom chose to be buried in the town, Lee in the crypt beneath Lee Chapel on W&L's campus, Jackson in the Stonewall Jackson Memorial Cemetery on Main Street, have continued to draw thousands of visitors each year since the end of the war. Other highlights for visitors were, and continue to be, the Stonewall Jackson House on Washington Street, Jackson's home before the war when he worked as a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, the Lexington Presbyterian Church on Main Street, where Jackson and his wife once taught Sunday school classes to slaves. The church was and still is commonly referred to as Stonewall Jackson's Church, and the Lee House on the campus of Washington and Lee University, where after the war, Lee lived with his wife during the last years of his life, serving as the college's president. But there is also the brick stable behind the Lee House where Lee's beloved horse Traveler once sought shelter. They still keep the doors open 24/7 so that the ghost of Traveler will always be able to find his way home. And there's Traveler's burial site beside Lee Chapel and Jackson's stuffed horse, Little Sorrel, located in the basement museum of Jackson Memorial Hall on the campus of the Virginia Military Institute, which was rebuilt lickety-split as soon as the war was over. Never had I known of a southern town so stuck in time and so stuck on its southern heritage. Even though I was born in Georgia, had ancestral roots in Georgia, and had traveled to Georgia every summer of my life since moving away at the age of 4, all of Lexington's Civil War talk made me feel uncomfortable, most especially because I knew, thanks to comments made by my Georgia relatives, that having lived in Michigan for 3 years, I now, to their ears, spoke with a northern accent. Is this why the clerks in the grocery store always seemed so unfriendly? After weeks of feeling like a falsely labeled Yankee trapped in a southern town that was stuck in some strange kind of a time warp, I found myself spiraling into a massively deep pool of self-pity. Unfortunately, it was about this same time that the Presbyterians of the area began to take notice of me. Lexington and its surrounding county of Rockbridge is blanketed with Presbyterian churches. Maybe this is why it was Presbyterians rather than Baptists or Methodists or Pentecostals who, like self-proclaimed earth-bound hounds of heaven, began to track me down in the aisles of every store I visited for the shopping needs of my family. First would come the, "Oh, you're new" look, followed by a few words of introductory chit-chat, names followed by sources of income. "Your husband works at W&L? How nice." Then came the question that always made me cringe. "So what church do you attend?" After informing my fellow shopper that I did not go to church, I would then receive the same pointed look I had been given years before at the junior high cafeteria table after my old friends, Martha and Julie and Judy, had discovered that I did not believe Jews were bound for hell. Next followed the invitation. "You should come visit our church," to which I would respond, "Thank you, but I prefer being outdoors on a Sunday morning, weather permitting, of course." At this point, their eyes would narrow, and I would hear a variation on the same theme. "Well, if you visited our church, you might decide that you like it." "Thank you," I always replied. "If I'm ever in the mood to attend church, I'll consider a visit to your church," which, of course, was a complete lie, and I think they knew it. But why in the hell couldn't they leave me alone? Did I have the word sinner emblazed across my forehead? Soon I came to realize that literally every single person, always it was a woman, who invited me to her church was a Presbyterian. After that, I changed the script. As soon as the question was asked, "What church do you attend?" I would then quickly interject, "You must be Presbyterian." A surprised but pleased look would cross my fellow shopper's face, and then she would say, "Why, yes, I am. How did you know?" "Presbyterians are quite distinct," I would say with a smile, and that usually prevented the invitation. Perhaps they assumed that only a Presbyterian would be able to identify a fellow Presbyterian so quickly. I was definitely back in the Bible Belt, where people took their scripture as the Word of God and the Republican Party as the political party of God. I was reminded of this fact because it was an election year, 1988, and the closer we got to Election Day, the more frequently I heard uncomplimentary comments about liberals flitting past my ears at the grocery store or in the post office. Never had I felt so other. Weeping over the unfairness of my fate, I lay in bed one night, snuffling as Paul slept beside me. How could he be so blissfully unaware of my agony? And how could he have been so heartless, insisting that we move away from the one place where we had been truly happy as a couple? How cruel of him to have forced me to move to such a small and depressing, politically and religiously conservative town where talk of the war, church, and the Republican Party buzzed around me like bees. Did Paul not care about me? I listened to him lightly snoring. Obviously not. Once again, I began to dream of the day when I would leave my heartless husband behind, taking Abby and Austin with me. In the divorce proceedings, I would argue before a judge that my husband had broken his long-ago promise to look for employment in large university towns where I would have had plenty of employment opportunities. Dinky little Lexington was not by any means a large university town. Though I had diligently searched for employment since our move, I had not been able to find a job on the campus of W&L or anywhere else in town. I felt rejected, not only by my husband, but by all of Lexington. That night, I silently cried out to the source of the inner voice, and probably because I was feeling angry rather than sad or scared, I used the name I had given to this source back when I was a teenager. Larger mind, I silently prayed. I can't take this anymore. Get me out of here. You must learn to love these people, came the soundless response from within. How in the hell am I supposed to do that? Volunteer work, was the immediate but silent answer I received. Volunteer work, I thought. You've got to be kidding. From what I had read in the local weekly paper, it seemed like all of the volunteer work in the area was handled by the churches, and I was in no mood to hang out with church people, especially since so many of them appeared to be Presbyterian. At this point, I preferred to give a wide berth to the Presbyterians, since I had no desire to re enter the ongoing years long theological debates I had had with my teenaged Presbyterian friends, Martha, Julie, and Judy. Suddenly, an article from the local paper popped into my mind. A small group of individuals, it had been reported, were hoping to establish Lexington's first ever recycling center. I considered the article for a few moments. I supposed that I might be of use to them. I had, after all, spent a small amount of time volunteering for the Michigan Environmental Council. Maybe it wasn't such a bad idea for me to do some volunteer work, especially if it were the type of work that would help to protect the Earth's environment. I knew I still very much cared about the state of our planet's air and water, and I also knew that recycling paper, plastics, metal, and glass helped to conserve our natural resources. Okay, I transmitted to the source of the inner voice. I'll give it a try. By the end of the month, not only was I serving as vice president of the Rockbridge Area Recycling Coalition, I also came to be in charge of the group's fundraising, even though I knew nothing at all about fundraising. And though this was a secular, nonprofit organization, I can't say that I was completely surprised when I discovered that one of the original organizers for the group was a conservative Presbyterian. It didn't take her long to sniff out the fact that I did not color within the lines of what she considered to be proper religious doctrine. "Aren't you worried about going to hell?" she asked one day. "The only thing I'm worried about is returning," I said. "I believe in reincarnation." "Who taught you to believe in reincarnation?" she asked. "No one," I said. "I just have this feeling that I've lived before, in other lifetimes before this one." She was stunned into silence, but a few days later she said, "I've decided that it might not be such a bad thing if reincarnation were true." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If reincarnation were real," she said, "that would mean people who don't believe in Jesus wouldn't necessarily go to hell after they die. They'd have another chance to live again, and maybe the next time around they'd accept Jesus." I smiled. Not only was I amused that a woman could be so overly concerned about the souls of other individuals, I was also surprised that she had not automatically dismissed the concept of reincarnation. For a conservative Presbyterian to consider the possibility that people might return to Earth lifetime after lifetime until they eventually discovered the truth was, to my mind, a heck of a lot more tolerant than believing folks will burn in hell forevermore if they don't accept the truth in this lifetime. "For your sake, I hope reincarnation is true," she said. And to my great relief, that ended our religious discussions. My religious encounters with Presbyterian shoppers in the aisles of the local stores also seemed to wane about this time. Maybe it was because I had become known as the woman who doesn't go to church, and folks were polite enough to leave me alone. Or maybe it was simply that my face no longer registered a look of extreme unhappiness, and I was therefore not drawing as much attention to myself. By this time, we had purchased a new home located at the edge of town. It had been easy for us to break the lease on the house we had been renting. Rental properties were scarce in Lexington, which meant that someone was always ready to pick up the lease on a rental property, most especially when it was spotlessly clean. Our new home was a recently constructed spec house with a yard of red clay. I spent many hours seeding, watering, and fertilizing grass, planting trees, shrubs, and flower beds, and helping Paul with his plans for a small vegetable garden. In addition to caring for the children, our new home, and our new yard, I was still serving as vice president of the Rockbridge Area Recycling Coalition, and now I was also actively volunteering for and sitting on the board of two other additional environmental groups in the area: Clean Air for Rockbridge and the Rockbridge Area Conservation Council. Because of my prior experience in broadcasting and the fact that, unlike most of the other volunteers for these organizations, I didn't work a paid job outside the home, I became a public outreach gal for each of these environmental organizations. 2 to 3 times a week, while my young children sat in the back of a room playing with whatever toys or coloring books I had packed for them, I would speak before school children, Ruritan groups, minister associations, churches, county home extension chapters, and business organizations. I also prepared newsletters and press releases that helped to educate the public about the area's most pressing environmental issues. In addition to the importance of establishing a recycling center, which in the long run helped taxpayers to prolong the life of the landfill, the area's foremost environmental concern quickly became a newly proposed coal-fired cogeneration plant that, had it been built, would have contributed greatly to the Shenandoah Valley's ongoing smog problem. Never had I imagined that I would enjoy public speaking so much. At last, I'm doing what I'm here to do, I remember thinking one day, utilizing skills that I had picked up during my days as a journalism student, my brief stint as a reporter, and my years of on-air work as a radio DJ. I was saving the earth now, while also learning how to love the people of Lexington and Rockbridge County. As soon as I stepped before an audience to speak about recycling, air quality issues, or the importance of preserving our planet's remaining natural resources, I would silently and quickly surrender my talk to the larger mind, asking that my voice be used, like an invisible syringe, to inject my audience members with the energy of whatever they most need at this time. It reminded me of when, as a teenager, I had asked for help in transmitting the beauty of Bach's Partita in A minor to the audience of All Souls Cathedral in Asheville. On that particular afternoon of my flute recital, feeling a swoosh of energy flowing through me to all those people sitting in the church's pews, I had felt as if I were making love in an invisible, from-the-heart way to each of them. Now again, I was making love to my audience members, only this time the vehicle wasn't music. It was environmental presentations. This is how I was meant to love others, I would silently proclaim at the end of each talk I gave. And from what I saw, I wasn't the only one feeling the love. The faces of my audience members often glowed in the same way the faces of my audience members had that afternoon during my flute concert at All Souls Cathedral. I was learning how to love the people of the Lexington area, and that felt good to my heart. At last, I was on my path. Now it seemed as if I viewed Lexington with new eyes. Often I caught myself admiring what I now thought of as Lexington's attractively quaint 19th century architecture. Talk about the war became nothing more than an endearing quirk of the town, and perhaps because I was no longer radiating a sullen, "I don't like it here" energy, the clerks in the grocery store began to routinely smile and chat with me during each of my weekly visits. Even the energy of the countryside, which had felt so dark and depressing to me initially, lightened up. Often while Paul was at work, I would take the kids on long car rides along the many winding country lanes of Rockbridge County, a good many of them narrow gravel roads, and I began to fall in love with the area's slow-paced, rural beauty. Why had I not been able to see it before? What scales had fallen from my eyes since our move to Lexington? Truly, my new home was worth protecting, and so I gave more and more of my time to weekly feats of environmental activism. Caring for my children, caring for the earth, and coming to love the people of Lexington were now my three top priorities. Always, I took my children with me when it was time to give a talk or when it was time to attend a public hearing concerning an environmental issue. Before too long, Abby began to proudly and sometimes publicly proclaim, "My mama's saving the earth." One day, busy as ever, packing Abby and Austin into the back seat of the car yet again in preparation for an environmental presentation I planned to give before a high school social studies class, I was unexpectedly hit with another message from within. "It is time to begin your writing." My writing? What in the hell? I silently transmitted to the source of the inner voice. I'm already writing. Each week, I kept busy writing environmentally themed press releases, letters to the editor, newsletter updates, or the scripts for the talks I gave. Always, I prepared each one of my talks from scratch, visualizing my intended audience in my mind's eye as I wrote, memorizing the entire talk so that I could maintain eye contact with as many people as possible during my presentations. "It is time to begin your writing," came the same soundless words from within. "But I'm doing exactly what I was asked to do," I silently countered. "I'm volunteering, I'm learning how to love the people here, but there's still so much more work to be done. The trees in the nearby St. Mary's Wilderness area are beginning to show signs of air pollution stress, and asthma rates in the children of this area are now higher than they've ever been. I need to keep bringing environmental awareness to the people of this area." I had grown so fanatical in my mission to save the earth that now, each evening before bed, I would stand for a few minutes before a framed picture of Earth that had been taken from outer space by one of the NASA astronauts. Sometimes tears would form in my eyes as I gazed upon this stunning picture of our blue and white planet. How could humanity continue to destroy such beauty? Even if our planet were nothing more than the product of a random mixing of stardust and gases, it was still an incredibly rare work of art. I had turned this same shot of Earth from outer space into a slide that I always presented at the end of every one of my environmental presentations. "This is a picture of our home," I would say. "Look how beautiful it is. Don't you think it's worth preserving?" "It is time to begin your writing," came the same silent message from within a day or so later. Okay, I silently transmitted. And since my environmental activism had often kept me away from the pages of my journal, I added, "I'll try to find the time to fit in more journal writing, okay?" Since I didn't receive that particular message again, I assumed that the source of the inner voice was satisfied. Dutifully, I did try to increase my number of journal entries each week, but it was hard, considering how busy I was. By this time, I was even beginning to worry that I wasn't spending enough quality time with Abby and Austin. True, they were always with me, but often I was holding a finger to my mouth, giving them the signal that it was time to be quiet. Either I was about to give a talk, or we were settling into seats at a public hearing, or it was time for a committee meeting to begin. They knew how to remain quiet. They were also very cooperative about the time we spent in the car as we traveled to and fro our many appointments. One day, We had to drive all the way over to Stanton, 40 miles north of Lexington, to pick up some newly printed Clean Air for Rockbridge brochures that had not been shipped. The printing company was located in Stanton's warehouse district. Had I known ahead of time how seedy this area was, I probably would not have taken my children with me. But here we were in this bad-looking section of town, and I was frantically slapping down the locks of the car doors in order to keep us safe. While we were stopped at a light, I had the time to take in the dismal sights surrounding us, the boarded-up houses on either side of the street, the dangerously angled limestone wall stretching precariously over a cracked, disheveled sidewalk, a drunk man asleep in the shadow of the wall, trash blowing around him and into the streets, tall, lanky boys pressed together in a circle, hunched, shoulders facing out, and the woman standing on the curb next to our car who appeared to be a prostitute, ebony skin, bright red lips, gigantic gold earrings that dangled over thin straps of a skin-tight dress showcasing two heavy breasts and a long line of cleavage. While Abby and Austin, oblivious to the city sights around us, babbled in the back seat, I suddenly found myself thinking, Creator of this realm, I just have to say, this is the ugliest piece of your creation I've ever laid eyes on. In an instant, everything changed. Suddenly, the boarded-up homes, the trash in the street, the leaning limestone wall, the drunk man, the boys across the street, the scantily clad woman on the sidewalk, everything was filled by and pulsing with the most beautiful light I had ever seen. In that instant, I felt like, for the first time ever, I was seeing our world as it truly is. This light, whatever it was, seemed to be alive, and it was everywhere, absolutely everywhere, as if it were a hidden backdrop to all things physical. Wow, I whispered. I stand corrected. As soon as I said those words, everything changed back to normal. The light went green, I hit the gas pedal, and we drove on. Two young children chattering and laughing in the back seat, a silent mom at the wheel, trying very hard to be normal, while another piece of her mind remained pinned to the remembered image of all that light, pulsing like a treasure inside some of the most mundane pieces of our physical existence. My vision of the light in the warehouse district of Stanton was stunning, but after a few days, the memory of my experience began to tumble around in my brain as if it were searching for an appropriate drawer where it might be properly filed. Though I had read stories about mystics who had received messages and even visions from what they believed to be God, I had not yet come across a story of anyone who had seen a pulsing light within physical matter. The only mental file I could create for such an experience was temporary psychosis due to a slight case of schizophrenia. By now, I had come up with my own working hypothesis about schizophrenia. Maybe a lot of folks, including all those religious prophets who had received messages or visions from quote-unquote God, fell somewhere on a schizophrenic spectrum. Schizophrenia might not be a black and white either-or condition. Maybe one could be a full-blown schizophrenic, no longer mentally connected to what we commonly refer to as reality, or only slightly schizophrenic, leaving our shared reality only occasionally. Maybe there was some kind of a hidden aperture in the mind that, if open, caused a person to receive incoming data that was, for most people, outside the realm of our physical senses, and perhaps even outside the boundaries of our particular dimension of existence. If this aperture in the mind became too wide open, a full-blown case of schizophrenia might develop within an individual, as had happened with my mother's cousin. But in my case, maybe my mind's invisible aperture was only partially open, causing me to experience the abnormal only occasionally. Although I knew there would never be a way for me to test my hypothesis, if my hypothesis were true, the light I had seen in the warehouse district of Stanton was nothing more than a quick image seen through a small but invisible aperture in my mind. Yes, the image was the most beautiful I had ever seen. And yes, at the time, it had felt more real to me than anything I had ever seen in ordinary reality. But because the experience served no practical purpose that I knew of, I decided that it was best for me to forget about it. After all, dwelling on such a sighting might cause my mind's aperture to grow larger. And where would I be then? A full-blown case of schizophrenia that would cause my mind to see the light in all things every day at all times? Or would my mind choose instead to return to what I had heard back in Chapel Hill, those hundreds of indecipherable voices that had seemed to fill a large but invisible auditorium? Now that I was a mother of young children, my incentive to be normal was stronger than ever. Therefore, I raced back into the busyness of my roles as mother and wife, volunteer environmental activist, and keeper of hearth and home. I had a good life, and I planned to keep it, most especially since I believed I had discovered at long last my soul's true calling. Unfortunately, shortly after seeing the light in the warehouse district of Stanton, it was as if an invisible tidal wave came hurtling towards me, and the foundation upon which my perfect life was perched began to erode. Whenever I remember this period of my life, I think of the scripture from Proverbs: "A man's mind plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." If this is true, then perhaps before any higher power can direct our feet, they must be forcefully shoved off our chosen path. I remember a dream from about this same time which exemplifies this concept perfectly. I dreamt I was walking across a wooden footbridge over a small river in the woods, enjoying the beauty of the surrounding trees, when someone rushed up from behind and pushed me over the railing of the bridge. As I was carried away by the swiftly moving waters of the river, I turned my head around to look behind me. Standing on the bank was a beautifully handsome, bare-chested man with a halo of shining golden curls, hands on his hips, his head thrown back in laughter. His face was lit with an inner light, as if Helios himself, the ancient Greek sun god, had come down from his chariot in the sky in order to push me into a river of rushing water. "Why did you do that?" I screamed in fury, but he only continued to laugh as the water carried me away. Little did I know when I awakened from that dream that soon I would experience a very similar shove in my waking life. It too came from a blonde-headed man, but his blonde hair was not curly and his face did not radiate light. And as far as I know, his shove was unintentional. The first time I saw him, he was walking towards me across the front lawn of the W&L campus. He was nothing more than a blurred image due to my nearsighted eyes, which were unadorned by glasses that day. But in my heart, it felt as if I already knew him. There was some kind of a connection between us, as if we were bound by strings of an invisible energy. How was such a thing possible? "Who is that?" I asked Paul, nodding towards the approaching man. We were standing in a long line of faculty in front of the Lee House, waiting to shake hands with the president of the college, who always hosted a faculty reception at the beginning of the fall semester. Paul, who had the far-sighted vision of an eagle, looked in the direction where I was staring. He told me the man's name, but it went in one ear and out the other. I could not have repeated the man's name even if my life had depended upon it. All I knew was that the name had not struck a chord of recognition. Why, then, was there this overwhelming sense of familiarity? "He's a member of the English department," Paul added. Inwardly, I recoiled. I did not like English professors and had avoided them like the plague in college. In my opinion, they were all walking, talking hot air balloons, full of countless fancy-sounding words that constantly fell like sprays of spit from their mouths. Their profuse flow of words, I believed, smothered their writing's potential for profundity and purpose. This is why I also believed they spent so much time analyzing the writings of others, most especially those boring classic novels and poems that featured far too many descriptions of ivy-shrouded windows and water-stained wallpaper, rain-soaked moors, and senseless phrases such as fearful symmetry or convulsed orange inch of moon or beauty like a tightened bow. How in the hell could I have felt such a strong and immediate connection to a blurred image of an English professor? Thank heavens the blurry man had not gotten close enough for introductions. Quickly I dismissed him from my mind, until I saw him again for the second time a week or so later, seated across the room from me during one of my environmental group meetings. Though I had not gotten a clear image of him during the first sighting, somehow I knew exactly who he was the second time I saw him. My face reddened. He was far more attractive than I had initially imagined him to be. But why in the hell was he here in my space? Environmental activism wasn't the realm of English professors. I avoided him during that meeting, and during the next meeting, and the next. But each time the space between us grew smaller and smaller, which gave me ample opportunity to study him. Why did he have to be so goddamned attractive? He could have leapt from the pages of a Harlequin romance novel with his ruggedly handsome, outdoorsy charm, his slightly tousled dark blonde hair that said, "I'm too sexy to bother with a comb," his worn jeans and scuffed leather boots that looked like they would be equally comfortable on the trail or in a workshop covered in sawdust. His chiseled jaw seemed forever to frame a confident, casual smile, and no matter where he sat or what position he chose, always he seemed to be posing for a jeans commercial. Whenever I was around him, I would find myself imagining my hands running down the thickness of his arms, my thighs pushing up against those faded, sexy jeans. "Holy fuck, get a grip," I would tell myself. "For goodness sake, he's an English professor." But he continued creeping closer and closer with each meeting. Before long, we were working together on a newsletter committee. Every time I sat within 10 feet of him, it felt like an invisible force field of energetic foreplay was taking place in the space between our bodies. I tried not to get too close to him for fear that I would break into a moan of ecstasy. "This can't be happening," I would internally scream. "Has a spell been cast upon me? Am I possessed by some kind of a demon? Please, please, take this away from me," I would silently scream to the larger mind. Soon, even when I wasn't around him, the English professor began to fill my mind for hours at a time every day. I felt as if I were in a daze. I couldn't get my regular work done. The children would often have to repeat my name several times before I realized they were speaking to me. It was as if a movie were playing constantly in my head. Sometimes I saw the English professor seated beside me on a park bench. Sometimes we were walking in a wood. Other times I saw myself cycling in front of his house, and he would call to me from his front porch. Always, in each of these short little scenarios, his eyes drew me in, then his arms, and at last those strong, manly lips above that handsome, chiseled jaw. And then, as if I weren't in enough agony, the nighttime dreams began. One night I woke up and my heart was racing. Holy fuck! Here I was having a non-physical, subconscious affair with a man in my dreams as I slept beside my own husband. Oh my God! This can't be happening. Hand over the center of my chest, I began to pray in the way I had as a child. Please, God, please, take this away from me. I don't want to have an affair with this man. Please, I beg of you, take away these feelings. No relief ever arrived. My sexual feelings for the English professor continued to grow and to grow. One night, at the end of yet another environmental meeting, the English professor confided to me that he and his wife had recently separated. In that instant, I was blasted by the most powerful burst of invisible sexual energy I had ever felt. Quickly, I stepped away from him, but when he offered to walk me to my car, I didn't say no. I felt like I was being reeled in by a strong but invisible rope. I wanted to withstand the force of this power, but it was growing too strong. My body yearned to be pressed against his. My tongue danced in anticipation for the kiss I knew was coming. No, I inwardly screamed. You can't do this. Turn away from him now. Say goodbye and leave. And then I tried to tell myself that if I had an affair with the English professor, Paul would surely sue me for a divorce, and, with the help of his attorney brother, he might possibly win full custody of our children. I had a friend who knew of another woman who had just lost custody of her children, and it was all because she had had an affair, and she had written about it in her journals, which her husband had secretly read and then publicly presented in court as evidence that his wife was not fit to be the mother of his children. If it had happened to her, it might happen to me. I couldn't lose my children. I couldn't. I would die if I lost my children. God, I inwardly screamed, please, if you don't want me to kiss this man, you have to do something now. I can't hold him off any longer. That was the moment the English professor reached into the pocket of his denim jacket to pull out a pack of cigarettes. Gross. Immediately, the spell was broken. As a teenager, I had once kissed a young man after he had been smoking. His mouth had tasted exactly the way an ashtray smells. When did you start smoking? I asked. With all the problems I've been going through recently, my marriage and all, I felt like I had to start smoking again. I'll quit once my life settles back down, he said. I said a quick goodbye and got in my car. But as I drove home that night, I was sure that some kind of a higher power had just saved me from kissing the English professor. How wonderful it was to finally be free of him. Thank you, thank you, thank you, I said aloud as I pulled into our driveway. After that, whenever the English professor came to mind, I would remember the image of that cigarette in his mouth, and I would remember the awful taste of that old boyfriend's ashtray-flavored mouth, and instantly my mind would become clear again. It felt so good to be free. At last, I could be fully present with the children again. At last, I was able to fully concentrate on my preparation for the talks I continued to give each week. But one night, the English professor called me at home. He had some questions concerning one of our upcoming environmental meetings. As we were talking business, Paul came to stand next to me. Irritated by the look of jealousy upon his face, I waved him away and he angrily left the room. At some point, my conversation with the English professor moved off the topic of environmental work onto the subject of poetry. He told me he liked to write poems, most especially about the outdoors, trees and rivers and mountains. I cringed at the thought. "I've never been a fan of poetry," I said. "Really? Why not?" "I guess there are probably a few poems I like, but so much of the time poetry doesn't make sense. For instance, I once had to read a stupid little poem back in high school about a red wheelbarrow. Oh my God, William Carlos Williams, that poem's great. I could teach an entire class on it." "You've got to be kidding." "No, that poem's a classic." Paul returned to stand beside me. With the glares he was giving me, I knew he could tell that my conversation with the English professor had moved beyond business. It was time for me to wrap up our conversation and get off the phone. Besides, I felt like the words of the English professor had just smacked me on the side of the head. How could he possibly be a fan of a poem that was so incredibly stupid? Was I missing something? The next day, I went to the public library. Thanks to the English professor, I now knew the name of the poet who had written this ridiculous sketch of a wheelbarrow in a chicken yard. It must have been a pretty famous poem because it was inside a number of different poetry anthologies. Standing there in the aisle of the library, I studied the poem. It was still one of the silliest things I'd ever read. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Holy hell. How could a professor spend an entire class period on this incredibly dinky poem? There was no form to it that I could see, and it didn't rhyme. Anyone could have scribbled something like this in a matter of seconds. Was the English professor crazy? I checked the anthology out and took it home so I could continue to study this small collection of words that made absolutely no sense. It was so short that in order to teach an entire class on this poem, you'd have to ask the students to repeat it as a sort of prayer mantra meditation exercise. Or maybe the students could spend the entire class period writing a series of jokes based upon the poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. So much depends. So much depends. So much depends. My mind was like a stuck record. Finally, after several more repeated readings, my mind became glued to the word depends. I continued to stare at this word as if it were the Rosetta Stone of all that Williams was attempting to communicate. And then it hit me. Holy crap! Williams had just forced me to focus on an object that I never would have noticed had I actually been walking by or even standing beside this chicken yard. I'm sure I would have noticed the white chickens, and I might have noticed the fence of the chicken yard and possibly even the lack of grass, since chickens like to eat grass and to scratch the earth looking for worms. But a red wheelbarrow in a chicken yard? No way. Who pays attention to a wheelbarrow, for God's sake? The farmer, that's who. The farmer who needs the wheelbarrow for shoveling the chicken shit. That red, rain-glazed wheelbarrow is what transports the chicken shit to a nearby garden or compost pile in order to help vegetables to grow. And even if the shit isn't used, it's still hauled away because who wants to be walking through thick piles of chicken shit each morning to get fresh eggs for breakfast? Oh my God. How come I hadn't been able to see it before? But now, in my mind's eye, I could clearly see the dark, rainy scene of the chicken yard Williams had forced me to imagine. And right there, in the corner of the chicken yard, was a spotlight shining on a red wheelbarrow. Williams had forced me to see the significance of what at first glance would have seemed insignificant. Wow, what other objects was I overlooking because I thought they were insignificant? Thanks to the inspiration of William Carlos Williams, I began to focus upon every single insignificant object I could possibly think to examine: the shiny gold knob of a closet door handle, a Y-shaped stick in the gravel of our drive, a toy car on the wooden floor, a small pebble in the middle of a sidewalk. With each item that I meditated upon, I wondered how that particular item might be more significant than it appeared to be. I had wanted to mimic Williams and to create a poem about an insignificant object that would force the mind of a reader to actually see the object. But no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't able to come up with any examples of significant, insignificant objects that pleased me. After a week, I ditched the project as nothing more than the folly of a fool. Although my poetry project was a waste of effort, my week of searching for significant, insignificant objects had kept my mind so completely occupied that not once during the week had I thought at all about the English professor. Unfortunately, shortly after I dropped the project, my mind became flooded yet again with thoughts and dreams about the English professor. The only difference was that now, in addition to a theme of sex, the scenes in my mind expanded to include additional characters: the English professor interacting with my family members over Thanksgiving, more detailed settings, scenes in restaurants, outdoor areas that always included a waterfall or lake, plot. Over and over again, I would see the English professor asking me to move in with him, and always I would pause, not knowing how to answer. And eventually, conflict. There was one imagined scene of conflict that never seemed to vary, no matter how many times it was replayed in my mind. Its setting was the fall faculty reception at W&L. Beneath one of the large blue and white tents that housed the long, steaming buffet tables. Always in this particular scene, I had just arrived at the reception on the arm of the English professor. Directly in front of me, I would see Paul, standing in front of a buffet table, a plate of food in his hands. Turning my way, Paul's sad eyes would lock onto mine, and always in that moment of this particular imagined scenario, I would know that there was still something unresolved between us. And I would think to myself, if you leave him, you will be forced to return to him again and again in lifetime after lifetime until you face what needs to be faced. Damnation! Why did I still have to believe in reincarnation? I had decided that the Catholics were right to believe in purgatory. Repeated lessons stretching across millennia and a classroom that seemed to last forever was certainly akin to purgatory. Or maybe it was simply hell. How ironic that the Presbyterians were so quick to declare who was bound for hell when they themselves, in my opinion, were already in hell. Couldn't they see we were all in the same boat, stuck in hell or purgatory, experiencing lifetime after lifetime till the end of the planet? Though at the rate humans were destroying the earth, perhaps our prison sentence would be shortened somewhat. Is this why humans were so wantonly destroying the planet? Was this humanity's attempt to destroy the prison that bound us all? Well, if I was stuck in hell until humanity destroyed the earth, I might as well have a little fun, I decided. I might not be able to cast off my beliefs in the higher power, but I could certainly say, "Fuck you." I had asked the source of the inner voice to put a stop to my sexual fantasies about the English professor, but what had happened? My prayers had been unanswered. Maybe it was time I stopped trying to be so good. It had been 2 months since my red wheelbarrow revelation. Now I was facing an appointment, what I had been thinking of as a date, with the English professor on a Friday afternoon in his office in order to discuss an upcoming environmental newsletter. He had made a point of asking me to stop by when he didn't have office hours scheduled with his students. That way, no one will bother us, he had said. I liked the sound of that. This is it, I said to myself once the day of our meeting arrived. This is the day I finally get to be physical with this man. Now there was a different scenario playing in my mind. Closing his office door behind me, I saw myself grabbing the bottom of my shirt and pulling it up over the top of my head. By the time I made it to the side of his desk where he was sitting, my bra was off, and I could see the pleased smile upon his face as I straddled his lap, my bare breast before him. Passionate kissing and fondling always followed. Then I saw him lifting me up to his desk and sweeping to the floor piles of papers and books so he could remove my jeans and my panties. "You will have to remember to be quiet," I said to myself. "The walls in those old buildings are thin." I had made arrangements for childcare with a cousin of mine from Georgia. He was by this time a W&L student. My meeting was scheduled for early afternoon. My cousin would be out of class by then, and Paul wouldn't be home until 5:30 or 6. I had 2 whole hours to be with the man I had been dreaming of night and day for so many, many agonizing months. I caught myself humming as I walked from the university parking lot on Jefferson Street up to the English professor's office, just a few buildings down the W&L colonnade from Paul's office. My hand was on the large metal knob of the front door when all of a sudden I found myself in an unexpected state of silent prayer. "You know what I'm about to do," I prayed. "Here's your chance to stop me. That is, if you can." I waited, but nothing happened. So I opened the door. From somewhere above, coming from one of the upper floors of the building, I heard the energetic babble of young college students. I assumed it was chatter from a nearby classroom, from a handful of students who had, for some reason or other, stayed late after their last class of the week to talk. Perhaps there was a party that night and someone had needed directions. But when I arrived at the hallway that led to the English professor's private office, I saw that the chatter was bubbling forth from a large group of students sitting cross-legged on the floor. They formed 2 lines, one line against each wall of the hallway. Slowly I walked between them. Hardly could I believe what I was seeing. This many students on a Friday afternoon? No student liked to stick around these campus buildings once the weekend had arrived. "You son of a gun," I transmitted to the larger mind. "I really thought I had you overpowered this time." A laugh almost escaped from my throat, but I quickly blocked it by blurting out a quick greeting to the English professor. "Hi," I called from his open doorway. "I thought you said you didn't have office hours this afternoon." He was at his desk, just as I had imagined he would be, but across from his desk was an attractive young co-ed, long blonde hair falling straight against her back, a notebook in her lap, a silly giggle in her throat. "I don't have office hours," he said. "They appeared out of nowhere. Would you like to reschedule?" "No," I said. "I think I can handle the next issue of the newsletter on my own. Thanks, though." I left, knowing that I would not attempt to arrange or agree to another private rendezvous with the English professor ever again. And because of that, I assumed my attraction to him was over. I was wrong. The very next day, to my great agony and dismay, my sexual thoughts and daydreams about the English professor returned. And over the next couple of weeks, the energy field between us continued to spark. Holy hell! What was needed, I decided, was a completely new tactic. Confession was supposed to be good for the soul. Well, I would give it a try. Paul and I were in the kitchen one late Saturday morning, the kids happily digging in their backyard sandbox, when I turned to him and confessed that I had become infatuated with the English professor. I don't know what exactly I was expecting from Paul, perhaps a look of shock or emotional anguish, or maybe even some tears. Instead, what I got from him was a violent eruption. He turned around from the sink where he had been washing breakfast dishes, picked up one of our kitchen chairs and slammed it more than once on top of our fake wood laminate-topped kitchen table. The blam of the chair against the table was quite loud. I thought for sure the entire table would come crashing to the floor, but those fake wood tables are pretty stable. Paul's temper tantrum resulted in nothing more than 2 small dents in the table's laminate top. Quickly, I glanced outside the kitchen window towards the children in their sandbox, but from the look of their busy, absorbed play, they hadn't heard a bit of Paul's tabletop commotion. "For heaven's sake," I hissed, "I don't want to have an affair, and I don't want to have him in my mind all the time. It's been agony for me. I thought that if I shared with you what I was going through, it might help. But now I see I shouldn't have said anything. Why in the hell are you so angry? I haven't even touched him." "It's like you're fucking him with your mind," Paul yelled. Wow. The guy who never cursed had just used the F word. I hadn't seen Paul this angry since he had kicked my green penny jar. He took a step towards me. The muscles of his face looked as if they were about to pop through his skin. Was he getting ready to hit me? Some part of me must have thought so, because all of a sudden, a tremendous power erupted from inside me, and in a quiet, calm voice I said, "You lay one hand on me, and I will kill you." I don't know why I had so much certainty in that moment that I was capable of killing my husband, but there was absolutely no doubt in my mind. Somehow, perhaps due to an adrenaline rush, I had transformed into a mighty warrior. My newly transformed warrior self watched Paul, and I could feel this part of me silently asking him, "Is it your day to die or not?" Is this the way it had been between us during whatever past life we had shared as enemies? Had we once fought to the death upon a battlefield, and if so, had I killed him in that long ago past? The next moment, it was as if an invisible bucket of cold water splashed against Paul's face. His whole body jolted ever so slightly. He blinked, and then he turned and walked back to the kitchen sink to finish the breakfast dishes. Holy fuck, I thought, as I walked out the front door a few minutes later to go for a walk. Absolutely everything was falling apart. My marriage, my life, my mind. Though I had been shocked by Paul's angry outburst, as I walked further from the house that morning, I became more disturbed by what had been my own quick transformation into a potential fighting machine. It wasn't the first time I had come face to face with my inner warrior. The first time was when, at the age of 8, I had spearheaded my battle against the mean boys beyond the hedge of our backyard, a battle that had resulted in the cracked head of an innocent 4-year-old boy. Though that experience had left me burdened with a heavy amount of guilt, 3 years later, I found myself instantly slipping back into warrior mode. One Saturday afternoon, when I was in the 5th grade, I had come upon two older boys who had my brother's sled pinned against the back wall of our house. Without a moment's hesitation, my inner warrior kicked into action. Hurtling towards the boys, I roared in rage, fist tightly clenched as my arms spun in huge, fast circles on either side of my body. It didn't matter that the boys outsized me. It didn't matter that they outnumbered me. The boys took one look at me and ran. It wasn't until years later, during the fall break of my sophomore year of college, that my inner warrior popped up again. I had been hiking alone at the base of a mountain that butted up against the back of my parents' property when, crashing down the mountain, came a brown and black dog, the size and shape of a furry wolf. He was snarling like a beast, ready to kill. His head was as tall as my belly, and his long black snout was wide open, revealing sharp, pointy teeth. Suddenly I found myself charging towards the beast, my arms straight up, high above my head, and from my throat erupted what sounded to my ears like the deep barks of a dog. It felt intuitively as if I were barking the canine message, "It is your day to die, and I will enjoy killing you." The dog must have sensed my certainty, or perhaps my insanity, because he quickly reversed his direction, and then it was I chasing the big bad dog up the side of the mountain. I chased him until I was no longer able to see or to hear him. Though a part of me wondered why my inner warrior had not revealed itself when the creepy janitor at WILS had been stalking me, another part of me was disturbed that I had such a violent creature hidden in my depths. If I were in this world to love, surely that meant that I shouldn't kill anyone. But it wasn't just my normally hidden but violent nature that disturbed me. Each time my inner warrior had revealed itself, not only had the thought of killing my enemy thrilled me, there had also been an accompanying sense of self-righteousness, as if a line had been drawn and I knew that I was on the side of good and my enemy on the side of bad. Never in those brief moments had there ever been any doubt in my mind that my enemy deserved to die. Had I been a self-righteous killer in a past life? A soldier, perhaps, during the Crusades, or a rabid religious fanatic who had once burned witches at the stake? Is this why I was here to love? Because I had killed rather than loved in my long ago past? For most of my life, I had always assumed I was, for the most part, a good person. But each time my inner warrior made its appearance, the certainty of my own goodness faded. I did not want to be bad. I was here to love, and surely that meant I was here to be good. But how could I be good if I was married to a man who only brought out the bad in me? "Clean out your closets," came a soundless message from within. What? "Clean out your closets," came the message again. No, I telepathically beamed towards the source of the inner voice. I don't feel like cleaning out my closets. But when I returned to the house half an hour later, I found myself opening our coat closet, and I began to clean. The following day, I tackled the two closets of our family room, which served double duty as a guest bedroom, and by that evening I moved on to the two closets in the children's room. But they were already in great shape because I made Abby and Austin put away their toys each night before bed. The next day, I progressed to my bedroom closet, which took most of the afternoon to clean, and after that, I moved on to Paul's closet, located immediately next to mine. By the end of the following afternoon, everything had been emptied from this last remaining closet except for Paul's old leather briefcase. I had initially put the briefcase in the back corner of the closet so that he could deal with it later, but then I decided that it might be best if I took care of it myself. Most of the satchel's contents were loose papers of math notes. I neatly stacked the papers into a pile on the floor beside our bed so that Paul could determine what needed to be saved and what could be recycled. And since the briefcase was too cracked and beat up to be donated to the Goodwill, I walked it over to my throwaway pile, turning it upside down to make sure everything had been emptied out. Down to the floor fluttered a white business card. Picking it up, I saw that it bore the name of a woman who worked for an office in Washington, D.C. As soon as I read her name, I thought to myself, Paul has had an affair with this woman. Later, when I confronted him with the business card, he said, "She's an old student of mine who wanted to keep in touch. That was inside a card she mailed to me while we were living up in Michigan." How interesting that he had saved the business card, but not the card itself. "So you've been keeping in touch with this old student of yours?" I asked. "No," he said. "She wrote me, but I never wrote her back." "You've had an affair with this woman, haven't you?" "No, I haven't," he said. "We were just friends." I don't know how I could tell, but I knew he was lying. How could I remain married to a man who lies to me? I thought. There was no longer any remaining doubt in my mind. I was going to leave Paul, and I would take the children with me. It was only a matter of when. Ironically, even though I suspected my husband of having had an affair, all I could think about was my own daydreamed encounters and nighttime dreamed encounters with the English professor. I knew beyond a shade of a doubt that I did not want to have an affair with this man, but the physical yearning to be with him never went away. Would this yearning continue even after I left Paul and took the kids with me to my parents' home in North Carolina? I couldn't remain in Lexington. There were no jobs for me. I would have to depend upon the charity of my parents until the kids were old enough to start school. The best time to leave, I had decided, was the beginning of the new school year. That would give Paul and the kids the rest of the summer to be together. One Saturday, while Paul and the children were away for the weekend visiting his parents in Virginia Beach, I was lying on the floor of our bedroom, flat on my back in complete surrender, arms and legs spread open like the drawing of the Da Vinci Man in the circle. This new pose was my latest prayer position. With my arms and legs spread wide apart, I felt as if my entire body were now a gigantic receiving antenna. I was determined to remain on the floor just as I was until I got a response to my question. Closing my eyes, I visualized yet again the light within all things, as I had seen it in the warehouse district of Stanton. I imagined it now filling the floor beneath me, the ceiling above me, each wall surrounding me, the bed to my left, the chest of drawers to my right, and the door beside it that led to the bathroom. Then I pictured this same light filling my entire body. "Why," I said aloud, "am I so infatuated with this English professor?" Immediately came a soundless response from within. "What does he represent?" The silent voice inside was exactly the same as it had always been. It didn't seem to matter how I thought about the source of the inner voice, how I pictured it, what name I gave it, or even if I didn't give it a name. That probably meant it was nothing more than the creation of my own subconscious mind, but I didn't care. I was desperate. This voice had given me answers in the past, and I needed an answer now, so I repeated my question. Why am I so infatuated with this English professor? Again came the same soundless response from within. What does he represent? God damn it! Here I was in the most melodramatic prayer pose I could possibly imagine, waiting for an answer I so badly needed, and all I was getting was another question? Surely my subconscious mind could do better than that. Again came the soundless voice from within. Only this time the silent words arrived more slowly than before. What does he represent? Oh, I said, he's a writer. Then I remembered an earlier inner message I had received. It is time to begin your writing. Holy hell. Was everything that had happened to me the result of not heeding that inner message? Or was my infatuation an example of what Carl Jung had once referred to as shadow work? I had learned long ago in my high school psychology class that what is hidden within the unconscious level of the psyche can sometimes be projected outside of the self onto another. At the time, I remember thinking, this is what had happened with Hitler and the Jews in Nazi Germany. Hitler had projected his own internal darkness onto a small segment of the population, and then he had somehow inspired most of the German people to do the same, so that the Jews became a sort of collective national scapegoat for the entire German people. At that time in my life, I had assumed that shadow work only pertained to bad people who had bad stuff inside their unconscious minds. But maybe some of what we held in our unconscious minds wasn't so bad. Maybe it was simply unknown. Could there be a writer hidden inside my unconscious mind? If so, what did this part of myself have to say? That afternoon, I made a beeline to the local Kmart and I purchased an inexpensive spiral-bound notebook. Now I wouldn't have to worry about my writing being messy. In my new notebook, I could hastily scribble anything that came to my mind, crossing out whatever words I didn't like, rewriting the same line if needed as many times as necessary, even doodling or drawing if I felt like it. But I knew there was no time to waste. As soon as I got back to the house with my new notebook, I grabbed a pen and I got to work. Less than an hour after receiving the inner message, what does he represent? I began to construct what I knew would eventually be my first real poem. Day after day, I worked on my composition in every spare moment I could find. My mind remained as happily occupied as it had been during my significant, insignificant object project, only this time I wasn't attempting to imitate the work of another poet. For the first time ever, I was allowing my heart to speak. I truly wanted to hear what it had to say. It took several days to complete, but late one evening I knew that at last my poem was finished. By that hour, everyone in the house was asleep but me. I was downstairs at the dining room table when I read through what I knew to be the final draft of my very first poem. In and out, rub, rub, rub. In and out, rub, rub, rub. Who is he, this man I see, and why did I let him enter me? In and out, rub, rub, rub. Long ago I used to know him. Long ago I said I loved him. In and out, rub, rub, sigh. I just can't remember why. As I read the last line, I felt wonderful, like a literary female version of Rocky Balboa when, in the movie Rocky, he runs all the way to the top of the long line of concrete steps in front of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and to the tune of Gonna Fly Now, jogs in place, both arms high above his head in a sign of victory. Yes, 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 my heart seemed to be singing. No longer did it matter that my marriage was dissolving. I had discovered the creative voice of my heart. The next morning, as soon as I woke up, I noticed immediately that there was something different. I lay in bed listening to the giggles of Abby and Austin in the room next door, the rattle of a cereal bag coming from Paul downstairs in the kitchen. Paul and the children had returned from their weekend trip to Virginia Beach the day before. These were typical sounds for a morning in our house. What was the difference? And then I realized my infatuation with the English professor was gone. That was when I remembered my finished poem, and my heart rang with joy. I had co-created a piece of art with my heart. For the first time ever, there had been a realness to my writing that I had never experienced as a journalist or as an environmental activist preparing public presentations, or even as I had been writing within the pages of my journal. I felt empowered. I felt reborn. I felt, holy crap, I felt a sudden urge to rush downstairs and share my finished poem with Paul. No way, I told myself. This poem is mine. I will never share it with anyone. It was written for me and for me alone. Listen to your heart, came the soundless voice from within. No, I silently responded. Absolutely not. And I fought off the urge to share my poem with Paul for the remainder of that day. Later that night, I had a dream that I was in a kitchen with two old white-haired women. Both women were kneading dough. One was bent over a small square table at the center of the kitchen. The other was bent over the counter to the right of a large kitchen sink. I was seated at the edge of the table, watching both as they concentrated on their separate piles of dough. And though neither one bothered to look at me, I could hear each of their soft, old lady voices very clearly inside my head. They were communicating to me telepathically. "Remember why you married him," came the voice of the old woman standing at the sink. But how had I known it was her? Her mouth had not moved. She had not even turned to look at me. "Well, he's not the man I thought he would be," I said aloud, watching the back of her body as she continued to knead her dough. "Child, you must listen to your heart," came the voice of the other old woman, the one kneading dough at the table. Though she was closer to me, she too neither moved her lips nor looked in my direction. "No!" I yelled, and now there were tears in my eyes. "He hurt me! He's a jerk!" "Child, you must listen to your heart," came the voice of the woman at the sink, only this time her message was accompanied by a sudden piercing pain in the region of my heart. "Ow!" I clutched my heart. "No," I said. "It hurts too much." "Child," came the same old woman voice, "you must listen to your heart." "No," I said. "I won't." I would not be bullied by these two old women. They didn't know what it was like to be hurt. He had to pay for what he had done. The pain in my chest increased. I fell out of my chair onto the floor, and there I writhed in agony, both hands clutching my heart. Why didn't they come to me? Couldn't they see I was in pain? "Help me," I gasped. "Listen to your heart, child," the second old woman said, and then her message began to repeat itself in my mind over and over again. "Listen to your heart, child. Listen to your heart, child. Even after I awoke, I could still hear her voice echoing in my head. Listen to your heart, child. Listen to your heart. Gradually, the pain in my chest began to subside. Even so, I continued to hold both my hands over my heart. Either I had suffered a heart attack, or I had just received a dream message that would be impossible to ignore. Might there be more dreams like it to follow if I did not heed its warning? Why did everything in my life always have to be so difficult? It wasn't until the following weekend, later in the evening, long after the children had been put to bed, that I found the courage to share my poem with Paul. He had just announced that he was going to bed and was on his way to the kitchen to get a drink of water. I told him to wait for me in the kitchen. I had something to share. As I raced up the stairs to retrieve my notebook, I found myself thinking, I hope those two old ladies knew what they were talking about. After Paul finished reading my poem, sitting at the kitchen table, he remained motionless for a long, long time. Had my poem made him angry? Was he going to find something to kick, or would he pick up a kitchen chair and begin to slam it against the table again? In silence, I waited. What was wrong? Why wasn't he moving? When at last he spoke, his voice was deep and gravelly. I saw now that there were tears in his eyes. Your poem is beautiful, he said. I only wish it weren't about me. That was when I knew there was far more to my husband than I had ever realized. Who is he? I wondered for the first time. In that moment, I decided that I wanted to come to know him, the real him, the significance of this man who, since we had moved to Lexington, had been feeling very insignificant to me. One night, not too long after he read my poem, there came a confession from Paul about a special friendship he had had, to use his words, with one of his former students from UNC. She was married, 6 years his senior, and her husband was stationed on a boat at the time, far away from Chapel Hill. She had been looking for a little fun. The relationship had lasted for almost 2 years during our early married life in Chapel Hill. I was stunned. Even though I had recently suspected him of having had an affair, it's one thing to think a thing, and quite another to hear it spoken aloud and confirmed by another. After a minute or two of stunned silence, my mind flashed red. How could he have done this to me? Back in those days, he had always been such a goody two-shoes. He had never cursed. He had never sped on the highway. He had always made straight A's. How could he have lied to me? And for so many years. I remembered how I had asked him during that period of our marriage if he were having an affair. I had kept having that dream, and though I had never been able to see her face, always it had been the same woman. A part of me had suspected even back then that he was having an affair. When I asked Paul how he had been able to lie to me over and over again, he said, "We never had intercourse. The farthest we ever got was heavy petting, so I didn't think it was an affair." A line of reasoning that would be repeated years later by an American president in defense of his relationship with a White House intern. "That business card I found," I asked him, "was it from your special friend?" "Yes," he said. "I'm so sorry." And he began to cry in a way I had never seen. But it didn't matter. My heart wasn't touched by his tears. Even if he had never had intercourse with this other woman, he had still been unfaithful, and even worse, he had lied. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" I asked. I was afraid you would leave, he said. And he was right. I would have left. I wanted to pack up and leave right then and there. If you leave him, came the soundless voice from within, he will never be honest again. Fuck off, I inwardly screamed to the source of the inner voice. And then it all came to me in a flash, the remembered sensation of when I had, as a teenager, received the inner message, the only reason you are here is to love. No, I telepathically transmitted to the source of the inner voice. I'm not falling for that shit again. I sat there glaring at Paul as he continued to cry. And then, like an incoming memo bubbling up from my subconscious mind, I remembered that I was a person who believed in reincarnation. Did I really want to repeat this lesson all over again with Paul in some future life experience? God damn it all to hell, I inwardly screamed. This isn't fair. And then, remembering once again the two old women from my dream, I imagined myself back in their kitchen, back in my chair next to the kitchen table, and I saw myself in my mind's eye asking them both, what in the fuck am I supposed to do? As I sat there in silence at my own kitchen table, reeling not only from the power of Paul's confession, but also the burn of my own inner rage, an idea slowly began to form itself in my mind. Perhaps those two old women from my dream, characters created by my subconscious mind, had answered me because now I knew what needed to be done. Now I knew how I would respond to Paul. You broke your vows to me, I said to him, and because of that, we are no longer husband and wife. Beginning tonight, you will sleep in the guest room. I could see Paul's body deflating, but I didn't care. I opened my mouth to continue. If you ever wish to be my husband again, you will have to win back my heart. You will have to court me all over again, though at this point, I can't imagine that I will ever want to go out on a date with you. But even if by some miraculous feat you're able to eventually win back my heart, you will have to marry me all over again. Paul was quiet now, staring at his hands clasped before him on the kitchen table, which he had so recently dented. If it comes to that, I continued, if you somehow convince me to marry you again, the marriage will need to take place in front of witnesses, 2 adult witnesses and Abby and Austin. And you will have to pay for new rings to be made since our old wedding bands mean absolutely shit right now. His face became pinched with emotion again. And one more thing, I added. Before you can even think about ever asking me out on a date again, you will have to agree to marriage counseling. Thank you, he said. I agree to your conditions. I hope that someday you will agree to marry me again. Paul and I went through a long and difficult period of healing. And though I can't really say how it happened, somehow he eventually convinced me to become his wife again. 9.5 years after the church wedding the Methodist minister George Robinson had officiated for us, we married again, this time in the privacy of our own living room. The month was June, and the windows were open. Breezes and birdsong filled the air. Cuttings from the sweet wild roses that were blooming on just about every cow fence in Rockbridge County now filled canning jars and vases scattered throughout our cozy living room. New wedding rings, handcrafted by a local jeweler, sat waiting for us on a tray in the middle of our coffee table. They each contained 3 woven strands of 14-karat gold. 1 strand to represent our bodies, the second strand to represent our minds, and the third strand to represent our souls. It was my hope that this time around our marital merging would be more complete. Now we knew what we were getting ourselves into. Now, hopefully, we would be more present with each other, more emotionally mature. And now, hopefully, this time around, we would try to truly love each other. Our two best friends were present as witnesses, as were our two young children. 5-year-old Abby, wearing her favorite pink satin slippers and matching summer dress, was in charge of music. She held the remote to our stereo. Years later, she would become a violinist, but on this day, she would be in charge of filling our living room with the beautiful string music of Bach once the ceremony was over. 3-year-old Austin, so proud of his new 3-piece suit, a dark blue miniature man outfit, as he called it, was in charge of the rings. When it was time, he would retrieve them from the coffee table and hand them to us one by one. Although I was playing the role of bride that day, I also played the role of minister. I lit a large white candle surrounded by white roses to begin the service, and, standing before my children and our two best friends, with my husband-to-be beside me, I stated aloud, "I invite every spiritual being of love who is aware of us and who wants the best for us to be present here today as witnesses to this new chapter of our relationship. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you for your presence." And in that moment, I felt in my heart that our living room became filled. It was as if there were suddenly now 100 living but invisible beings standing all around us. Perhaps it was the presence of angels I felt, or maybe the spirits of our ancestors. The presence of all those lovingly radiant others felt so real to me, so intense, and so very, very humbling that I couldn't help myself. I began to cry. Austin walked up to me, his face full of concern. Placing a hand on my leg, he said, "Mama?" "Mama's all right," I said, patting his head. "I'm crying because I feel surrounded by so much love right now." Paul said his vows first, his arms wrapped tightly around me, and then I said my vows to him. But I couldn't stop crying. My voice was barely audible, but he continued to hold me, and I made it through to the end of my vows. My heart felt peeled to its very core that day, and I knew then, for the first time ever, that I had finally given myself completely to my husband and our relationship. We were at last, I now believed, truly married. Once the door to change has been opened, more changes are always sure to follow. Now that I had seen firsthand the tremendous impact of my writing upon my life and also Paul's, I continued trying to explore this creative voice of my heart. Unlike the silent inner voice, whose messages I had been receiving since I was a child, the creative voice of my heart felt as if it were truly mine, as if it came from some deeper part of me that was more authentic than the voice of my surface self, the voice of my ego or personality. I always felt more fully myself when I gave freedom to my creative voice on paper, which is why I now devoted at least an hour of each day to my writing. I wrote poetry and songs, which filled me with great joy. But my surface self, my ego, soon took control, and before I knew it, I had produced what my ego considered to be quite practical. Two short, environmentally themed children's books, which, if published, would surely help someday to further my work in environmental education. Though a part of me thrilled at the idea of allowing my creative voice full freedom, there was also this practically minded, of the world ego self who still believed that the most important work I could ever accomplish outside of raising my children was raising awareness about our planet's environmental degradation. This part of me tried over and over again to co-opt my creative voice in order to keep my mind focused upon the environment. But one night, at a Virginia Department of Transportation public hearing, I overheard a comment which would change the trajectory of my writing forever. The comment came from a man whom I had labeled one of our environmental converts. He was a local politician who had decided to publicly oppose the area's proposed coal-fired cogeneration plant. And yet at this particular public hearing, he had turned to a man sitting beside him in the back of the room where I was standing and had mumbled in a low voice a comment about these damn tree huggers. I felt stung by his comment. I was one of the damn tree huggers who had shown up to publicly protest VDOT's plan to destroy a swath of trees along Route 39 in order to widen a portion of the highway to 4 lanes. How could this man, this local politician who had come to realize the importance of protecting our air, not love trees? In all of my environmental presentations I had ever given, I had preached about the importance of trees. They provided us with so many gifts: oxygen, cooling shade, air filtration, soil and water preservation, and of course, the wood we used in our homes. Since I assumed this local politician was a member of a church that professed a belief in God's created world, I found myself wondering, where was his love for God's creation? And then I was struck with an insight. We humans cannot truly love what is outside ourselves if we have not yet learned to love what is inside ourselves. And love of self cannot be accomplished without full knowledge of the self, both the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. But did I fully know and therefore love myself? No, I suddenly realized I did not. Could this have been the true meaning of the message, "The only reason you are here is to love," that I had received as a teenager? Long ago, I had taken the message to mean that I was here to love others, basically to do good works for others, an interpretation that may have been rooted in my Methodist upbringing. Maybe that is the main reason I had been inwardly led to several individuals who had appeared to need my help back when I was a college student. I had asked to be put to work so that I could begin loving or helping others, and I had been put to work. But had these individuals truly been helped by me? Perhaps the young pianist would not have killed himself. Perhaps the anthropology professor found the true friend that she had needed. And perhaps my father and my parents' marriage would have turned out fine without any help from me. Every time in my life that I had attempted to help another, I might, in reality, have only helped myself by creating for myself the impression that I was a good person. Didn't good people do good works? And thinking about all of my recent environmental work, I had to ask myself, had I helped the earth in any real way? Looking at the man who made the disparaging remark about tree huggers, I decided the answer to that question was no. That was the moment I decided to walk away from my environmental volunteer work. To really make a difference to our planet's environmental health, humans would have to be taught how to truly love the earth. But humans would never truly love the earth if they did not fully love themselves. And they could not fully love themselves, I believed, unless they took the time and the trouble to come to know themselves, even at the unconscious level. But before humanity could ever be convinced to tackle such a task, there would have to be a great number of individuals who voluntarily dove down into the murky depths of themselves in order to know and to embrace and eventually to love the totality of who and what they are. I decided that night at the VDOT public hearing that I would become such a volunteer. I would, to the best of my abilities, try to learn how to love myself by first coming to know myself. Writing would be my primary tool for self-discovery. I planned to begin each day in silent meditation, and out of the quiet stillness within myself, I would then write about whatever I happened to unearth, feelings, insights, visions, and dreams, and I would allow my writing to take whatever form it wished to take. I would not control it anymore. I wouldn't judge it. I would try my best to honor whatever bubbled up from within me. But in order for such an experiment to work, I knew that I needed to jettison all unnecessary busyness from my life. Although it pained me to do so, I resigned from the 3 environmental organizations upon whose boards I had sat for several years. My environmental friends were shocked and even angered. One man asked, "How can you abandon the earth like this? Don't you realize we're fighting a war? Things are only going to get worse. This is not the sort of thing you can walk away from." "I'm sorry," I told him, "but I must honor what is in my heart, and my heart is telling me that I need to devote more time to my writing." He shook his head in disgust and walked away. And I realized then that probably no one in this world was ever going to applaud what I was about to do. But that was okay. I didn't need the approval of others. I had launched myself upon an experiment, and it felt good to my heart. One morning, I began my daily meditation with the following thought: may I come to fully know myself in order that I may fully love myself. It was not a prayer directed to any larger force or higher power. It was simply a statement to myself. But because I recognized that I could probably use a little outside help, I decided I would also pray to the larger mind. I had come to think of the larger mind as the light within all things, which to me was the energy of consciousness within all things. Picturing this light now, I silently transmitted the following prayer: I open myself to receiving any help that you are able to give me. Instantly came a vision, as if a movie had begun to play inside my mind. I saw myself within my mind's eye, seated upon the floor of a desert. Before me in the sand sat an ancient, cross-legged Native American couple, long gray braids on either side of their heads, perfectly straight backs, rugged, treeless hills standing in the background behind them. In a flash, and to my great surprise, my body launched itself into a prostrate position upon the desert floor. "Grandmother, grandfather," I found myself saying, Thank you for being here." Then came the voice of grandmother inside my head. "Rise and look," she said. I sat back up and turned to my right. There, racing towards me, was the most repulsive toddler I had ever seen. As she ran towards me, her arms outstretched, her jet black hair streaming behind her, I could see that the skin of her naked body was partially rotten. Black and ashy gray spots of decomposition covered every inch of her body. Even her mouth, wide open in a smile, was full of dark, rotting teeth. "You must embrace her," came the voice of grandmother again from inside my head. "Oh no," I thought, and I closed my eyes, turning my head away from the girl. Only then was I able to open my arms to her. My eyes remained tightly shut as I felt the weight of the repulsive toddler land in my lap. And in that moment, I could also feel that I, too, was now naked. Though it made me want to gag, I could feel the toddler's putrid mouth closed around the nipple of my body's left breast. And then I felt the milk as it began to flow from my breast. I dared not open my eyes. To look upon her at such a close range would surely cause me to die. "Open your eyes," came the voice of grandmother. I opened my eyes, but I made sure to keep my head turned away from the girl. "Look," grandmother commanded. Slowly, I turned my head and looked down upon the child in my arms. To my utter surprise and delight, the once repulsive, rot-filled little girl had transformed. In my arms lay a beautifully plump toddler with shining eyes and rosy cheeks and a smile that revealed 2 rows of pearly white baby teeth. That's when the vision ended, and I knew then that I had just received important instructions for my own personal transformation. Only by facing and eventually embracing the blackest, most fear-producing aspects of myself would I ever be able to become a fuller, more consciously integrated version of myself. Since I very much wanted such a transformation for myself, for the 3rd time in my life, I got on my knees and I prayed. "Grandmother," I said, "please help me to face what needs to be faced and to embrace that which needs to be embraced." And then, to my surprise, came a soundless message from within. "It is time to make your peace with Christianity." Instantly, my gut wrenched. My mind became wrapped in a turban of fear, and from my mouth trickled these 4 plaintive words. "But I'm not ready."